Good afternoon and welcome to The Hard Truth with Brent Turvey and Melanie Ingles. Today is October 11th, I'm told. It's 2021. This is episode 2. And this week we're going to talk about the CSI effect on the crime lab crisis, which I have been dealing with not just my entire career, but also in the last week. So welcome everyone and welcome Melanie. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I always feel like I'm like the water's just right here. The water is just right here.
Just doggy paddle. Surviving.
I'm trying. doggy, but be careful. Let's come on. This is their children watching. All right, so
okay.
This week let's talk about what the problem is. The problem that we encounter in our casework, and you're becoming more and more familiar with this every day. You've been familiar with it for a long time from one perspective. And now that you've moved into forensic examinations, you are familiar with it from another perspective. The problem is several things converging at once. The first thing is that we don't have enough people who are competently trained in forensic examination and physical evidence collection and the forensic examination of that evidence. Second problem is the people that we do have bad training, have bad methodology, bad practices. So the few people we have don't really understand the process of the methodology or its scientific limitations. And they are ridiculously, hopelessly underfunded because the funding goes to other things. And this is not something that's prioritized. Crime labs are on the priority somewhere just below public schools and public libraries, somewhere in that realm. It seems to be in the public consciousness. And then, of course, that creates a crisis of science in the courtroom. The courtroom has this belief that it's getting good science because the state says it is. And what you're really getting are, people who are not scientists testifying on scientific matters. And from that disposition, I've written a number of textbooks which cover this issue, including crime reconstruction, which is all about how to properly interpret the evidence. So let's talk just a little bit. Melanie, you've experienced this from your perspective in different realms. I'm going to be very critical during this episode because that's how I am. And what I would like for you to do is for you to remind me if I'm being too critical or not critical enough. Just as a regular person, when you first started your work, what was your impression about the capability of law enforcement to effectively use forensic science in criminal investigations? What was your perception of that? What was your perspective on that?
I would say that at the beginning, when I was going through the law enforcement journey myself, I had a belief that there was professionals who were highly educated in this area, and that not only were they educated and doing these things at a level, above everybody else, but they were being done correctly. And I'm finding now that not only are some things completely missed, some aren't even done, and some are just fabricated altogether. So I believe that I fell into the category of, like we said before, watching these shows, right? Like this CSI, Las Vegas, and Dexter, and all these different things that are focusing on these expertise. And I just believe that that's what it was within a police force, that's the type of person that would be dealing with all of this. And I've learned that it is not that way at all.
Yeah. So that's the problem right there, is that people think forensic science, and they think police. And that's the first problem, because law enforcement should have nothing to do with forensic science. And this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of the scientific community, which it has been their opinion for years. But over the years, because of the advent of DNA and things like that, we're able to understand better all of the mistakes that the crime labs are making, all the bias that's evident, and all the wrongful convictions that they have allowed to happen, or they've actually facilitated. And this is the biggest hurdle. I recall testifying in a rape homicide case in California, where the prosecutor was getting furious with me. I was testifying for the defense, doing crime reconstruction on a staged crime scene. And the prosecutor was getting furious with me because he was trying to get me to say that I wasn't a police officer. And this is a common theme with me in court. You're not a police officer. Why are you testifying about forensic science? Only police officers can testify about that. And that seems to be the notion that many prosecutors lead with, whether they understand it's a lie or not. Because what in their mind, a forensic scientist is someone that they own, that they employ, and whose testimony they can control. And we've had a I mean, there are numerous examples of prosecutors over the years being found to have just directly intimidate their own forensic people, but they can't complain about it. So you don't really hear about it. They have employment contracts. They have chain of command. If they complain about problems inside their agency, they have to take the mantle of a whistleblower and risk being fired and having to prove that they're a whistleblower. So that's part of what's going on. A bigger problem. Let's take these problems one at a time. Let's talk about essentially what is the CSI effect. Can you give me your perspective of it? Because I know you've read up on it recently and you've experienced it directly. I'll give like firm definitions and concepts, but there's a lot of people have different ideas of what this idea means and what this notion is, and it is a demonstrable effect. A lot of people say it's not real. From your perspective, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but just develop that a little bit more for me from your perspective.
I think that there's two different perspectives that I was reading about, because one of them I actually wasn't even thinking about. But it would be this notion that everything can be looked at a crime scene, collected, run through the database, examined, and everything can come to a conclusion very quickly. But that there's this belief that there's this unlimited funding and we've got the experts and this is just how it happens based on the things that we're watching on TV, because that's how they sum it up in 60 minutes. So you go to the crime scene, you find everything's run through, boom, you found the bad guy. So there was that perspective, which I had, but when I was reading about it, the problem that people have when they're looking to go into a career. So you have the younger generation looking for the careers they're interested in. And if they're following these types of shows, they have this belief that when they go into, say, criminal profiling or forensics, that's what it's going to be like. All this amazing, these labs and how everything will just come together and everything just works out, where you go into these classes and it's nothing like that. So there's a lot of, I find, disappointment, people dropping out because it's not what they thought it was going to be, all from these TV shows.
That's such a great summary of it from the perspective, I think, of a student. That's a lot of your empathy is showing, and it's making me look like what I am, which is non-empathetic. So thank you.
That's not difficult.
I wasn't even thinking about the student. Yeah, it's not my fault.
It's not difficult.
It's not. Oh, I thought you said it's not my fault.
I guess it's not my fault, and it's not difficult.
There we go. That's true. All right, so we have several problems. One is the certainty, because there's this belief that there's this technology and funding which will provide competent examiners who can be certain, and that it will be done rapidly. Like you can go from removing the print from an object, or discovering the print on an object, removing it, and then running it through a system that'll give you a result in about 5 to 10 minutes,
right?
As though that's a thing. And that the computers are actually the things deciding this stuff, that it's very objective, when that's not true at all. No computer makes any decision about any match or any comparison or any examination. It always has to be done by an analyst at the end. Whether it's fingerprinting or DNA, it's an analyst making the interpretation. It's not a machine doing it. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, of course, it's not fast. It can take weeks, months, or even years to get evidence tested, if it's tested at all. And then finally, what you said was really great about basically lying to students about the kind of jobs that will be available to them. There is this, as a result, this false belief in the high-tech, rapid accuracy and certainty of forensic science, where there's a lot of jobs and a lot of just a lot of ability. What you find is, in general, that's not true. I mean, the law enforcement agencies are not known for hiring people because they're particularly capable. What they hire people for is their loyalty and their politics. And that is because of what the mission of law enforcement is. And those people who work in an adjunct fashion with law enforcement, you've got to toe the local, cultural, political line. So the other part of the CSI effect, which is what creates the false impression on the part of the courts and the jury, that's the first part. But then now, once this false impression exists, it's in the ether, it exists in the world. Now people will expect professionals to do that. So people have an expectation that forensic examiners will conduct themselves precisely as they do on television, or they're not real. And I would like to say that this is something that only the general public has a problem with, but the reality is that not only does the professional community fall in line with those beliefs, because they don't really actually know either, they're all just kind of pretending, but then professionals kind of have to do it too. So you have the public expectation, the professional context of the court expecting it, and then you have also the examiners who feel like they got to live up to that. And the real problem with that is too many forensic examiners actually just wear the costume. That's one of the reasons why we talk about sort of this theatrical forensics, or forensic cosplay, where people are expected to behave a certain way in order to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
The worst thing is that they're also expected to give findings that they should never give.
Mm-hmm.
I was in court last week in Saltillo, as I mentioned. One of the things that the attorney did, the defense attorney, my client did, that they should never do, is they asked me a question that was completely inappropriate for any forensic examiner. And I think I mentioned this to you. They asked me, after I gave all my evidence and victimology and reconstruction and vulnerability and intersectionality, and it was very powerful. She stood up and asked me, so can you tell me who you think did it? Now, this is the other problem. This comes right on the CSI effect, right? Because there is this ignorant belief among the public and even professionals in the judiciary who work either as attorneys or agents of the court of some kind, or judges themselves, even juries, that they believe you're going to tell them who did it.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me a little about that before I tell you what I did, because to me it's
I wanted to hear what
right?
you said. How did you respond to that? That's what I want to know.
Here's where this becomes fun. Now, you know me a little, so tell me what you think I said. Do you think I told them who did it?
No, I don't think no, I don't think you did.
Yeah. You bet all the money in your pocket on that, because they wanted me to. The court wanted me to, the prosecution wanted me to, and the defense wanted me to.
Yeah, but you don't, you're not a sheep. So I'm going to say that you didn't.
All right. You all the money in your pocket is safe. I would never do that.
See?
No, it's good. It's good that you know. I was testing you just a little bit, because I'm like, what kind of a person do you think I am? Would I do that?
Oh, so don't ask that. Don't ask those questions.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's please don't answer that question.
No, I won't.
Well, no, because you will. You'll tell people what you think. Nobody wants that yet. All right. So the issue is, what is the role of the forensic expert in court? They're there to teach. They're there to educate, to inform the decision makers. The decision makers are the judges and the juries. All right. Those people need to make decisions, as well as the attorneys, but that comes before court, hopefully. So in this case, they asked me whether or not I thought they did it. And I've written about this subject many times, because it's a violation of professional ethics to even engage in this sort of thing. And in the United States, this question would be unlawful. And it would be a violation of any court instructions for an expert to give an opinion on the ultimate issue. It's called the ultimate issue. All right. The ultimate issue is, what's the issue there that the jury or the judges are deciding. And in Mexico, they don't have a jury system. They have a system of magistrates like Europe. In fact, the United States is one of the only places in the world where you can find a jury system, because we are hopelessly outdated. We have no business using regular people or juries to make these decisions, in my opinion, but that's not the law. The law says they are. So right now we have to be in that's the system we're in. Mainly because juries are the science basically shows that juries are easy to manipulate with emotional arguments. And that's why there are jury consultants. That's why there are people there whose whole goal is to bring up things that are contextually irrelevant and scientifically invalid in order to sway the emotions of jurors who are not properly educated on the process, or even their role in the process. In fact, it's actually in some states a violation of, it's actually considered jury tampering to try to educate them, to try to teach them. So there's a really big fight to keep jurors ignorant. Fortunately, in some jurisdictions, the jury pool is really just made up of people who are fairly switched on and can make good decisions. And in other jurisdictions, they're not. And it's a county by county, it's very different. This is all big buildup to say, I have a long history of not answering this kind of question. And you could never trick me with this. If I were to answer that question, one, it would violate my ethical oath to not participate as the 13th juror, because I'm not there to rule on the ultimate issue. I'm there to advise and to give information. But the other thing is that I always consider questions which ask me to violate my professional ethics. I consider those questions to be a trap, because one, it will be used against me at a later time. And
Mhm.
two, it could be used in the appeal process for this case to overturn the verdict of the court. So I'm not going to interfere with that. I mean, I would never do that. So my answer was this. I said, well, I said, I'm not comfortable. I told him on the record, I said, I'm not comfortable answering that question directly, but I will say this. If you look at my timeline of you can look at the reconstruction and the timeline, you know that there's only two people who have access to this child. It was a child homicide. There's only two people with access to this child. And the timeline makes it very clear who the child is alone with during the periods during which she was injured. And those injuries resulted in her death. So I think that answers the question.
Mhm. Do you think, because I think that before I started learning all of this, I was under the impression, along with a lot of other people, I would assume, that that is the pivotal moment in the court, right? The expert gets up and they put out all the evidence and then they say, and this is who did it, right? Like I feel, do people still, is that what they're waiting for? They're still just waiting for that pivotal moment where everything falls into place and that's it.
Because in a movie, that's what happens, right? In a
In
movie
all
or in a
those
TV show.
shows, yeah.
Yeah, it's a witness on the stand doing this, either, and it's usually a fact witness, someone who's a witness to the actual crime or the event, and that's fine. But that's not to be confused with an expert witness who's only there to represent the evidence and what the evidence
Right.
means and how it can be interpreted within the limits of science, which sounds very boring, and it can be or it cannot be. For example, in the case that I just testified in, there were several failures that are echoed in the United States. In the United States, we have the same exact problems that they have in Mexico. They're just muted, or they're just we're better at our PR, and we like to pretend we're better than other countries at delivering justice, which we're not. So the first thing in this case that was problematic is that they arrested the mother and her boyfriend for the murder of this child, and they arrested the mother hoping to get her to give them evidence against the boyfriend, who they suspected of it. And she was not cooperative. So they tortured her. And by tortured her, I mean they put a plastic bag over her head. They put hot peppers on her eyes. They threw her on the ground and they kicked her. And this was in the prosecutor's office. Now you would say, oh my God, well, that's just her saying that. No, it's not. Her family walked in on her. There were other witnesses. There were like three prosecutors and several police and several of their investigators in the room when they did it. And they kept taking turns doing it while she was on the floor. And she described the event perfectly. She described all of the context. She described where everybody was, what the office layout was. She did it all from memory. And the other thing is they took photos of it. They documented what they did to her because they're all proud of it. They all think they're doing God's work, or they all think they're doing something that should be done. They've got that righteous rage that's going on. So they documented it and they wrote it in their reports. It was shameless. This is what impunity is. And in the United States, we do the same thing. I worked a case in Oklahoma Oklahoma versus Elvis Thacker, where the police busted into a guy's house, and it was a sexual homicide case. So they were all ginned up. They had 5 agencies. They pretended not to be police. They pretended to be gas and electric people. They broke into the house with Cops TV and they shot him. And when he was on the ground bleeding to death, they tased him from 2 different directions. And then they proceeded for the next half hour to deny him medical attention and to then not just deny medical attention for like 35 minutes, and then question him. And when he didn't answer the questions properly, they cycled the taser and you could hear it. And then they lied in court and said they didn't do any of those things, except for the taser videos are all uploaded automatically. So we got the taser videos and we got the cops video, the documentary TV program videos. And it was 17 officers from 5 different agencies testified, and they all perjured themselves in this case in Oklahoma versus Elvis Thacker. And the court refused to charge any of them with perjury. Outright refused. And I testified for the first time in the U.S. on the Istanbul protocols of torture in that case. So in this case, in Mexico, the first case thing was they tortured her. Then they went to the crime scene twice, and each time they stole things from it, whether it be items of value or documents or clothing, memorabilia, because he's a very famous baseball player, this guy. He's actually a former pitcher for the New York Yankees. His name is Sergio Mitre. And he living in Mexico at the time. And but they documented it again. And if you just compare what they collected versus what got submitted for testing, they didn't do it. So that's the first level, is the quality and the character of the people that are being hired for these positions. This kind of stuff happens in the U.S. too. What do you think are the things that are stolen most often from a crime scene by investigators in the United States, Mexico, or anywhere? What do you think they are? Tell me what you think, because I'll tell you when you're done. I love this issue.
Money, drugs,
Money and drugs. Those are, in fact, there are entire
food.
units of law enforcement that are set up just to identify places that will have money and cash, so that when they go, they can target them and they can seize that cash. Either take it surreptitiously and pretend it was never there, or take it as a asset forfeiture related to, so they can roll it into their training budget and spend it in a way that whatever way they want. Mm-hmm. So money and drugs. What else? Those are the two big ones. Very good.
Food. Depending on where you are.
Food for sure. Yeah, they steal food all the time. They'll eat right at the crime scene. What else?
Anything valuable, like you said, especially in that case when you're dealing with a famous baseball player.
When I see, yeah, totally agree. Keep going. Love it. What else? I
would say electronics, things like that, TVs, computers, anything that's supposed to go into everything, like a laptop, perhaps, phones.
Very good. That's the big one right there. The biggest one I would say after everything else is cell phones.
Yeah.
They steal, because cell phones are worth between $800 and $1,500, depending on what kind of phone you have. That's a huge item that you can just walk out with if nobody sees it. And that happens a lot. Also, Xboxes, things like game stations.
Game systems, yeah.
How in the world can they sneak it out of the crime scene? Let me tell you how. They can collect it into a bag. They find a bag at the place. They collect it into that bag, and they put it into their vehicle. They just put it in their vehicle like they're going to voucher it, and it never gets vouchered as evidence. In Mexico, what I've seen them do is put it in a bag and put it with the body, so they can go collect it at the ME's office. So when the body leaves, the body gets set off and waits, and it has a waiting area. So they go to the waiting area to do the confirmation and there's a process of validating the evidence receiving, and that requires the officer who did it to be present. So they're present, and then they just use that event to move the item. But there's another one, not just illegal drugs, but prescription medication. There have been many medical examiners who have stolen prescription medication from crime scenes. That's a big one. So the problem is ethics. First problem is ethics. We have a lot of people who are being hired who are not actually, we're not good people. Let's put it that way. They're happy to steal, lie, and falsify reports. This happens a lot in the States, and we follow it all the time. Whether it's officers leaving the scene of a DUI, or changing their seat with their spouse or their girlfriend, or officers moving things around to the scene or removing things from the scene that they shouldn't. Happens a great deal. So that's the first problem. The next problem is the ability of the lab to test things. And that's the other problem that we have, is we think that if they're wearing the right costume, if they look like a scientist, they must be one, even though they don't have necessarily the education, training, or experience. One of the things that tell me what your experience is with that before I tell you how we studied the issue and how it came out. Tell me about what your impressions have been and have converted to about the qualifications specifically of people working in forensic science.
I'm not sure there is much of a qualification to get into forensic science currently in law enforcement, in that realm of things. And what I was going to say just previous to that is that if you are ethical and you have morals, my own personal experience, I can tell you that you will not get hired. So I already know the type of people that they're putting on to the services and the type of people they want. And if those are the people that are being pushed into these forensic areas, then I had no idea. I am extremely concerned at this point with all the things that I'm learning now, though.
You're absolutely right about that. When I was a younger guy, a long time ago, I used to believe in this community sense of forensic science. Like we were all scientists, we're all in this together, and we're all working on the same problem. So we should, in a way, look out for each other. And I'll give you a quick example. I was working on a homicide case in Las Vegas, and this case involved testimony from a younger criminalist who worked in the DNA section of the Metro Las Vegas crime lab, the one that's CSI is based on. And we had her on the stand, and I had examined the case, and I made a list of all the things that they collected but didn't test. And the first hour of my testimony in that case was the police trying to deny they collected evidence or that it even existed and that I was making it up. So I would have to go through the photos and say, there's the item right there. There's the slip saying you collected it. And then now it's gone. And they would try to know that didn't exist. What are you talking about? They're, oh, okay. So we did this like 5 or 6 times in this case, showing them that the evidence they denied existed at the scene and that they collected it. Because here's the thing about lawyers. Lawyers don't have to tell the truth in court. They just make arguments. They make you prove everything that you're saying, which as a scientist, I don't mind at all. So they're doing that. And one of the things I'm doing is documenting all the stuff they haven't tested. And so they asked immediately, they had the criminalist testify after me. And she's like, oh, yeah, this is ridiculous. We're not doing this. We're not doing that. And Mr. Turvey, I was not a doctor at the time. They said, Mr. Turvey's not, he's not correct. We don't care about these things, and we're certainly not testing them. And they asked her directly, young lady, is there any evidence right now currently being tested at the lab that's on this list that was prepared by Mr. Turvey? And she's like, of course not. We're not doing that. Then after I get off the stand, after she gets off the stand, the next day they send us a list of new test results of many of the things that they've been testing that were on that list because they're required to disclose it. So they brought her back to testify again. And I knew they were gonna destroy her. If she went on the stand and lied again, she would be destroyed. Her career would be over. So I felt guilty, just a little bit. And I went down to the courthouse, and I was like, when she came in, I said, look, I know you're waiting to testify, but you need to tell the truth. The only way out of this, you're in a hole right now. You need to tell the truth, or your career is going to be over. And she's like, oh, no, it's okay. And I said, why? She goes, no, I work for the state. The prosecutor told me that I can say whatever I want. It doesn't matter because the defense doesn't need to know these things. It's just court tactics. They're just using tactics. So it's okay not to tell the truth because he's the one in charge of whether or not I'll get prosecuted. So I won't be arrested. I'll be fine. It doesn't matter what I say. And I said, do you realize what you just told me? And she's like, oh, no, we do it all the time. It's just lawyers playing games. And I'm like, no, you're in court lying. You can't do that. So she kind of took my advice, but about 3 years later, she got fired from that lab for fabricating DNA results. And it was, I got to say, it made me realize that the quality of the people that were coming into the court and the quality of the attorneys that were pressuring them, the coercive factors, the fact that were constraining them, they were not allowing for good science. So I stopped believing in this notion that it was going to be good people doing good things all the time, especially at a state-run facility. And they hate hearing that. It makes them furious because they know you're telling the truth. They get very angry with you when you start talking about these particular cultural problems. So what we have done, because of the work I did a textbook on forensic fraud, and it's quoted and used in crime reconstruction extensively. This is about 1/3 of forensic fraud takes place in the form of resume falsification, falsifying your credentials, your education, training, or experience, falsifying your job history, or leaving out pertinent things like you went to jail and have a drug addiction or something like that. These are very important things. So your certifications with certain types of evidence, as well as your formal education, as well as your experience working cases or your publications. What we have noticed is that the rate of forensic fraud is not low. I would say, and 85% of the fraud that occurs in court occurs on behalf of the prosecution because they employ and control most of the forensic testimony. In Mexico, I have not found a single examiner yet that has not been fraudulent in their resume, their certifications, or their education. So we examine the resume of every single forensic expert in every case, whether they working on our side or working on someone else's side. We don't care about that. We don't want to be associated with people who are lying. Mm-hmm. One of the things I learned, and this was something that you probably recall from the program that we taught on profiling, I was not able to find a single FBI profiler during the time of my work where I was doing a lot of evaluations of FBI cases and profiles. There was a period of time where I couldn't think of a single FBI trained profiler who had not committed overt fraud regarding their resume, lying about their resume, lying about their education, lying about their training, lying about their experience. And eventually, as we slowly got these things on the record and got these guys removed from court, there's not a single FBI profiler who's not touched by it, who hasn't done it, as far as I can tell. The FBI profiling unit essentially died. It no longer exists. We've talked about this before, but it no longer exists in the same form. So respond to me a little bit about that. Does that surprise you, or does that make you think, oh, that sounds about right?
Well, it would have surprised me at the beginning. It definitely surprised me, but now, no, now it doesn't surprise me at all. just given like the case that we were going over yesterday with the, blood splatter and things like that. And I'm looking at this and thinking, how did this expert, I'm not an expert, but I know that, this picture, that's not right. That shouldn't be there. How do I know that? And so-called expert didn't know that. So I'm seeing these things with and FBI profilers. I feel like that might be shocking to some people that are listening to this, because we all know FBI profilers. We all know what they're capable of, and they're the top of, they do everything.
Yeah.
And I was shocked to learn all of these things.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example, just so people know what I'm talking about. There's a guy named Mark Safrick, and he was one of the top FBI profilers for about 10 years. And he lied repeatedly about his education. He claimed he had a degree in human physiology from UC Irvine. Well, no, he has a degree from the School of Animal Husbandry. The reason why this matters is because he constantly claimed in court that he was just like a medical examiner because of this education, where he had extensive knowledge of human anatomy and physiology and should be allowed to testify about wound pattern analysis, even though he had no formal education or training in this area. So he was lying about his education, about the nature of his degree, to give the court the impression that he had more qualifications than he did. But a more pertinent lie, and this is when you dig it down and you drill it out, is that he claimed he had worked thousands of cases of rape and homicide. All right. Now, here's the problem. When you're working with the FBI, you don't work rapes and homicides. You don't have that authority. You only can consult on some cases, but he certainly hadn't done thousands working for the FBI. He claimed he did. So we put him on the stand and asked him, where did you get your homicide experience? Not working for the FBI. No. Working for UC Irvine as a police detective. And he said, yes. And we got the crime stats, and there were no rapes and homicides during the years that he was served there. None. No rapes or homicides while he served there. So he didn't get it there. So then so it's not there. Oh, I guess I forgot. What I meant to say was, I worked with the FBI at the Wind River Indian Reservation, and I worked over 4,000 homicides there. Really? Okay, there were no new homicides while you were there either. There were a lot of missing cases. None of them got established. He goes, well, but I reinvestigated them on my own and reprocessed every crime scene on my own.
On his own,
without any authority or initiative, because it's tribal land. Anyway, so they get caught in these lies, and then they start tripping while falling, trying to explain themselves, thinking that you're not smart enough to know the rules or to know what the limitations are of these guys. There was another FBI profiler named Greg McCrary, who was a press who basically preceded Mark Safrick at the the behavioral analysis unit, and he lied about his resume all the time. He claimed he had a master's degree in psychology from the School of Psychological Services at Marymount University. The problem is that degree program doesn't exist. He had a school of professional. He had a master's degree in professional psychological services, which is a guidance counselor degree, right? It's not about clinical hours or evaluating people or making diagnoses. It's about career guidance. All right.
That's much different.
Much different. And it's from the School of Education, not the School of Psychology. Why does this matter? Because he was going into court giving diagnoses in his profiles. And he was claiming he was qualified to do it.
So just to clarify for anyone else who's watching, when this happens, because I've seen this happen with coroners in the States on one of our cases, actually. Yeah. When that happens, do they open up, or they have to go through all of those cases that expert has testified in, right?
Let's back up and tell people the nature of the case that we're working on. We have a case involving a medical examiner doing what? What's the issue?
Falsifying the cause of death and all the evidence, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was part of it. One, I'm working a case right now in Connecticut from an older medical examiner who came from Russia, who got basically forced to resign because he was taking bribes. In Connecticut, he was taking bribes. This is not some new event for the United States. What's supposed to happen? This is a great question. What's supposed to happen when someone at the crime lab or at the medical examiner's office is found to be fraudulent in their resume, found to be fraudulent in their examinations, or to be what we call dry labbing, which is faking things? And this is related to the crisis, because you have people of this character doing this on a regular basis on many cases. When one person's doing it, it's not like they're doing it on one case. They're doing it on all the cases that they touch, potentially. Mm-hmm. So, and if you don't know which cases might also be involved, you have to do a full systems review of every case they've worked on. This has shut laboratories down. There's a great documentary on Netflix right now called "How to Make a Crime Lab Scandal," and it's about the Annie Ducon case. And that was one of the biggest scandals in the history of forensic science, in terms of it being, I think, at the end of the day, it was something between 12 and 15,000 cases got overturned because she was faking laboratory results. She was giving findings before they were done and then saying she'd done them and just writing the reports without doing the analysis. She was clearing cases at a rate 3 to 5 times faster than the people around her in her same position in her environment. And they all knew she was doing it. What?
I was going to say, and what some people don't understand is the impact that has on somebody's life. So you're falsifying something or being paid to say something by the prosecution or whoever you're getting paid by, and that directly impacts whoever the offender or whoever's on trial, their life. And they could go, they could be charged, they could go to jail for however long, and there was no proof of anything anyway.
Let me suggest this to you. They do know how it affects people's lives, and they believe that those people deserve to have this happen to them.
I mean, general population.
Oh, general population.
Like when we're talking about something like this, that's sometimes something that isn't thought of. Like the whole process isn't thought through. Like, well, okay, they're lying on the resume, but what does that really do? Like, what was that for status? No, that directly impacts somebody's life to do something like that.
So you're much more nice than I am. I actually think the general public does know, and they consider law enforcement corruption to be part of the process. And they also, here's what I think it's a dirty Harry mentality. There's this dirty Harry mentality that people have about the police, especially older people. They think in the same way that they watch movies. Who are our heroes in movies? Rambo, John McClane, Nakatomi Plaza. This my generation. Your generation is different than mine, but it's these very aggressive violent male fantasies where you die getting justice. So justice at any price. Justice at any price with extreme violence. There is this belief that that's what's expected of law enforcement. There are a lot of law enforcement in my country right now, in the United States, talking about how, the time for talk is over. Now is the time for violence. And now is the time for this and that. These are people who have this violent fantasy of this violent gunslinger fantasy about justice. And they measure justice in terms of how much damage they inflict on the people they think that deserve it. And they keep electing politicians who will do that. They keep electing politicians who are cruel and who speak about delivering justice at any cost in a violent fashion and swiftly. The only kind of swift, I'm going to put it to you, let's make this very clear. Swift justice is no justice at all. Swift justice is an invitation for fraud and deceit and violence. And that's what people want. So I will disagree with you on that point. You're a very smart person, but I'm just going to say, tell me what you think. You think I'm wrong about that? You think, because I just don't have faith in my country anymore. Maybe your country, yes. But in my country, I think we vote people in like that to do this kind of thing because we have this dirty, hairy idea of, kill them before they get a chance to do it again. Just kill them all. Like they all deserve it. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Yeah. I don't think I was thinking of it from that perspective.
Well, and I'm thinking about it too much probably. But the point is, what I've seen is when I talk to an individual person, they show empathy. When you talk to groups of people who are collecting on this issue, they immediately become violent and aggressive, and they want violence. They want to hang. Mobs like to hang people, and they want to do it fast because they don't want to be responsible for what's coming next. So I'm not sure I agree that they don't know. So that's the first problem. The public, I think, does know how crappy things are. The public, I think, does have a sense that real justice isn't coming for these people that are affected and impacted. And I think we have an obligation to make it very clear that that's wrong. Because I just don't think, especially in the professional community, because the professional community is influenced and coerced by the political elements, by their supervisory elements, and by public opinion. We have a responsibility to be better than that, and to be better than the screaming masses who want
absolutely
justice. That's maybe I'm being too harsh.
You're not too harsh. It's not.
Maybe I'm not being too harsh enough.
Maybe.
Yeah.
That might be it. I think I think what I was getting at, I do understand what you're saying, and I'm
Yeah.
not going to argue that point because I believe that definitely is happening. But what I mean by the general population maybe not understanding is there's this blind, at least here,
Yeah.
there's this blind trust from start to finish with our heroes that are in blue,
Yep.
that something's going to happen. They get called to the scene. It's going to be investigated to the best of everyone's ability, which we know is lacking. And
Yep.
then it's going to go to the court, and then justice will be served. And there's no questioning. Like if we were to talk about an expert falsifying resumes or stuff like that, it still would be like, well, you know, like it must have, that person was picked as the suspect because of something.
Yeah.
There's this blind trust and this inability to see it from any other perspective other than they did their job and they did it properly. We can't question that. And that's what I see everywhere in conversation.
Yeah, that's the hard. It's really hard to have this conversation with anyone outside the justice system because unless it's affecting them directly, they don't want to talk about it. And then for those people inside the justice system, they either understand and are completely jaded, or they understand and are doing it and they don't want to talk about it.
Right.
So,
which I've run into that a lot.
Right. If and that's the problem, is acknowledging what the limits of law enforcement are, acknowledging what the role is, and that the CSI effect is being exploited by people who are not knowledgeable in forensic science in order to create the illusion of a case that is certain. I'm working on a case right now, for example, in another state, and did a crime. I was asked to do a crime reconstruction. A guy was beaten to death right outside of found beaten to death in an alley in the snow, right outside of a gas station behind it in an alleyway. And there was blood everywhere. And they asked me to do a bloodstain pattern analysis. I said, sure, I'll do that. And I'll do this and I'll do that. And the whole case, they're like, don't worry about, we just want to know what happened. We know our guy did it because his palm print is found there at the scene in the victim's blood, frozen on the side of a reefer van. And I'm like, okay, I'll just take a look. And I had Valeria Balthazar, my criminalist. She helped me with the assessment. And she came to me, Brent, and said, Brent, these fingerprints don't match. I'm like, what? I didn't even look at that. So she showed me, and you can see the palm print, the known palm print, and the palm print found at the scene. They're not even close to the same. And what should immediately happen when you identify this massive, gross error, getting back to your original question, is that there should be a complete top to bottom review of every case that examiner has worked on to see if they made the same kind of error. And that's why sometimes crime labs get entirely shut down, because you have one examiner whose impact on a particular evidence section is so great that section can no longer be trusted. Well, that doesn't happen unilaterally. Some agencies are what first thing that has to happen is the prosecutor has to send out an actual formal memo to the defense saying this examiner's resume or this examiner's work or this examiner's testimony has been called into question and they are being investigated, or they have been fired, or they have been removed from casework and being retrained, whatever. So you need to know that this examiner has this problem. The next thing that should happen is they should have a review of their cases. But in many states, they'll just say, well, we're going to put a broad announcement out, and then if anybody has a problem, they can bring it to us. We're not basically forcing the defense to prove misconduct in cases where they already know that there's been an examiner who cannot be trusted, who's lied under oath. In other places, it's like the difference between agencies that disclose their law enforcement misconduct and agencies that don't. There's a thing that exists in the criminal justice system, and they're called either a Brady list, a Lewis list, or a Lawrence list. They're also better known as a blacklist. Prosecutors all keep a list of forensic examiners and police officers that they cannot put on the stand because of their problems, because either they're under investigation, or they've lied under oath, or because they falsified evidence. The real question is, why are these people still employed? But that's a question for another day. All I know is those lists exist. And there is a fight, a terrible big fight over the existence of these lists. Prosecutors do not like to give out the resumes, the actual full resumes of their officers or their forensic examiners. And when that's true, it's actually a red flag that there's obviously some fraud or problems. But also they don't want to give out the personnel records of officers. Now, the thing is, it's like they're treating everybody like they're children. You wouldn't understand why this guy doesn't have training, but he's claiming to be an expert in this area. Or you wouldn't understand why he gets so many complaints for a use of force. Or you wouldn't understand why there's so many complaints of him planting evidence. What we invariably find is that when one of these guys finally gets completely destroyed by a real investigation or real inquiry, you go back and you find they've been doing it for 15, 20 years and everybody's been hiding it. That's the thing that I think upsets me the most, because there's supposed to be a review. The process itself should be transparent. There's supposed to be a review when there's a complaint, and that review should be public. Tell me what you think about that, because that's in the United States, the capacity for that really only comes from the media. The media is not applying pressure. And if forensic experts are not, on the other side, are not disclosing these things, we would be completely blind. The public would be completely blind to how bad things are in law enforcement and in the crime labs. How is it in Canada with these things?
I think that everyone is completely blind in Canada to these issues. I know that I definitely was, and I was involved in the law enforcement sort of life as I was going through the recruitment process and all of that. And I was blind to that. The media, like you said, every once in a while you'll get some push from families, but it'll be covered and then it'll just get washed away. I started seeing a lot of this when I was working the missing person cases for Please Bring Me Home. There was a lot of, as I reflected actually, all of these cases when I was talking about DNA or any sort of analysis or the database for unidentified bodies, I've never once been spoken to by a forensic scientist. Never once. It's always an officer that reaches out and says, oh, well, we didn't do that and we can't do that. So then I started to see, is anybody doing this at all? Is this just a belief I had because I watched those shows and but what's actually going on? And I don't think we are aware of any of it, actually.
I will put it to you this way. So there's several ways that this happens. You have a crime scene, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, people will be surprised to learn that even in a sexual assault or even a attempted murder or shooting or something like that, detectives don't always respond to the crime scene, nor do forensic personnel. Forensic personnel are only come when the head detective calls them. Now, this is the thing. Not every case is assigned a detective. We got a case right now in Salinas. I'm working on several cases in Salinas, California. They don't have homicide investigators there. They have units that get assigned to cases, but there are no detectives and no lead detectives. When I work sexual assault cases, let's say in Kansas, there's nobody who understands that they're the lead investigator. You have different people with different parts of the process, none of them in charge. So there's no consolidation of information, which means that even if there's a crime scene, the evidence is maybe not collected. Right. That's the first thing. So even if there's a crime scene, maybe the evidence is not collected. The evidence that is collected may not get tested. The evidence that is tested may not get tested properly. And the evidence that is tested properly might not get reported accurately to the people who are concerned, because very often that information is delivered by police officers and prosecutors and not forensic scientists. So you just identified a really big weakness in the chain.
Right. And that's what we were running into. I know that on a lot of the cases I was working on, the families, that was their greatest concern. Why? Like my loved one is missing. They haven't taken any, like the expectation is to come and collect a bunch of things, collect DNA, start running it against unidentified bodies, the databases, starting to see if, they're in a hospital somewhere, all of those sorts of things. And it's not being done. So we're going back to law enforcement, whoever the head investigator or detective is on that case, and asking these questions. And they're, they could be 15 years old, they could be 5 years old, whatever. But they're like, oh, well, we didn't do that. Well, why did we not do that? What's the problem? Well, we can't do that. And so I'm asking all these, well, why can't you do that? And I'm not getting any answers. And it's just like, this, just something we don't do.
Yeah. So let's summarize the problem a little bit, and then let's talk about solutions between you and I. You think? Because we got about 10 minutes left. I want to cover this right. So first of all, the problem is you don't have enough people that are properly trained. The people that we do have are definitely not properly trained. They don't have good access to good science or resources for it, and they're employed by law enforcement, which means they're controlled by them. We have this belief because of movies and television that they have this high capacity for rapid results that are absolutely certain. And this creates not only a false belief on the part of the citizenry, but on the part of the justice system, And it creates a false notion that law enforcement can use to bluff their way through cases, not having to actually do examinations. But it also creates a false expectation on the part of forensic examiners to meet that belief. So you're going to get asked questions in court that you shouldn't answer. I'm working another case right now in Connecticut that I saw happen in 2005, and I've just been hired in the appeal process, involving a serial murderer who was convicted based on the testimony of one of my mentors, Dr. Henry Lee. And he in court said, I've linked these cases together with behavior. I've linked these cases together with DNA, and he is responsible. He actually in court pointed to the guy and said, he's responsible. They asked him that question, that same question I got asked in Mexico. In Mexico, I got asked that question. He got asked that question in Connecticut. When he did it, I actually took the article and pulled the stuff out, the testimony out. I'm like, I posted it to a group. I'm like, this is exactly a problem. It's going to cause a lot of trouble. This is grounds for reversible error. If anybody in this organization ever does this, we have to kick them out because we have a rule saying not to do that. And by the way, the person who taught me that rule is this guy right here who just broke it. So the problem is, as of many perspectives, and like you said, the result is that innocent people get hurt. The result is that cases don't get investigated properly or don't get investigated at all. Tell me from your perspective, having worked these cases, what do you think some of the solutions are?
Like the cases with you or the cold case? Because I find that they're completely.
Let's talk bigger than that.
Different.
Yeah, I know, right? We have very different perspectives and experience for sure. But what I want is your experience, your perspective on what forensic scientists need to do to address these problems in your mind. In your mind, what do you expect that you're not getting that you'd like to see?
I expect that when I'm looking at a forensic scientist or an expert in the cases, I'm just referring to the ones that we've went over recently. I would expect that I would look at it and not question it or not ask questions based on my lack of expertise in the area versus what I'm looking at. That it doesn't make any sense to me. The training isn't there. I don't think that people are qualified. I think there needs to be a total overhaul in that area and have different training, more advanced training, and not be hired by services themselves. Because in Canada, I know that privatized institutions are not something that they use. They hire from within. So all the experts are hired by law enforcement, right? So there's a bias there because they're on the side of law enforcement. I think that all of those things need to change before we're going to get anywhere in that area. I don't know.
So you've got two issues that come to your mind. One is hiring better people with better quality people. Two, making sure that those people have good training. And three, making sure that you don't hire them if they don't have the right qualification. You don't put them in the wrong job, right?
Don't put them in the wrong job. Yeah.
So the problem is that, as you said, you outlined the problem perfectly. Law enforcement controls who gets in many regions, not every region, but in many regions, law enforcement controls who gets hired as a forensic expert. And they also control who gets requested to come to a crime scene. We're working a case right now where there's a police officer involved in the death of his girlfriend, and he calls 911 and he makes a specific request for a specific person to respond to the crime scene, which at the end of the day is very clearly staged. Yes. I mean, this is not a mistake on his part. This is in Illinois. So that problem exists already. I would say there's a couple other things. One is that there has to be transparency. There has to be the embrace of transparency by the scientific community that works for law enforcement. And by that, I mean making sure that your resume is attached to every single report. There are jurisdictions that do that, and that should happen. Your resume should be attached to every report that you provide, just like I do, right? Just like every legitimate forensic examiner does. And that resume should be checked and verified on every single case. Any attorney, defense, prosecutor, anybody who's proffering an expert for court, you should review the resume to make sure it's good. Do your due diligence. And then there has to be a check by the opposing counsel on the truth of that resume. And then they have to actually cross-examine them in court and challenge them and challenge their findings. But the responsibility from scientists is to be knowledgeable in their area, have their certifications up to date before they do their examination, to actually read the most recent literature related to their examinations and to incorporate that into their findings. So in other words, they have an obligation to be current and competent, right? This is a big idea for a lot of forensic people who don't see that as their responsibility. They see it as only their responsibility to affect the policy of their agency. But the next thing is there has to be a willingness on the part of the criminal justice community to have a zero tolerance policy for criminality in law enforcement, forensic science, wherever. If somebody gets on the stand and lies, a judge must have them criminally charged, must ensure that they're criminally charged. The problem is they're doing this too often for the prosecution, and that would damage the prosecution case. So they're not going to do that. They're not going to go out. They'll even, like I said, one of the most offensive things I ever saw was in the Oklahoma versus Elvis Thacker case, where 17 or more law enforcement officers from multiple agencies got up on the stand and lied, and then it got shown that they were lying, and the judge refused to do anything, even when the defense attorney read the statute for perjury onto the stand, and the judge conceded it and just said, yeah, I'm not going to do it. I don't have to. Impunity.
How often would you find that a judge would be siding with the prosecution anyway? Because that's something that, like, sorry, I was going to say that all of them are kind of, in the same side, and so they don't do anything about it.
At the federal level, it's 95% of the time.
Yeah,
95% of the time, they're going to admit experts and admit and hear objections from the prosecution, and without question, without doubt. The defense gets hammered constantly, has to prove itself constantly in those contexts. But in some, it really depends on the jurisdiction. In some jurisdictions, it's going to be 100% of the time. In other jurisdictions, you might have a judge who's a former defense attorney, and then that judge will tend to be more fair, right? If a judge has been a defense attorney, they tend to be more fair. If a judge has been a prosecutor or a police officer, the notion of fairness is essentially gone. You're going to have to fight your way to any sort of science or justice or admissibility. It's going to be a big fight. And there's been a lot of research on this area. We cite it all in our books in crime reconstruction and forensic fraud. Also, I got a question from the public. Roger Lichty says, can the defense call on private forensic scientists? Well, that's a great question, Roger. The answer is yes with an if and no with a but. Okay, so it depends on lots of things. If the defendant has a lot of wealth, then they can afford to hire their own forensic examiners, and they can afford to question and check and challenge the state's evidence against them if they're wealthy. If you are not wealthy, then you have to rely on the state. The state, and that will be the judge. The judge will decide whether or not there's adequate access to funding for experts that's going to be provided. In some jurisdictions, not a problem. I think California is very good at this. Kansas is very good at this. Oregon is very good at this. Connecticut is very good at this. Florida can be good at this, providing funds for indigent defendants who need to have their evidence reviewed independently. So that's possible. But there's a third variable, and that is the competence and quality of defense attorneys. Are they educated to the point where they can actually know the process for requesting money? A lot of defense attorneys either don't know how to request money and get their defense funded by the state. They're just ashamed to do it. They don't know how, or they don't want to do it because these are their friends. The people who work for the prosecution and people who are the judges, they're their friends, and they don't want to appear to be uncollegial or unfriendly. So the answer is yes, if the court is willing to fund it and if the defense is competent enough to ask. That's the best way. Your thoughts on that, Melanie? Because it's a big one, right? We're doing it.
I was going to say we're the ones doing it in those places that you spoke of. But it's still kind of baffling to me. Some people the prosecution, I think, is hoping, or they're hoping that the defense doesn't have the knowledge to do.
Right. Not the knowledge, but the balls. They don't want them. They're the best attorneys. Yeah. The best attorneys are going to be the ones who fight. Who fight for their client and for the client's rights. If the state is putting on an honorable defense or an honorable prosecution with honorable evidence and reliable experts and good police, what's the problem? Mm-hmm. What's the problem with wanting somebody to check the quality of your homework? That's called the adversarial system. We are in an adversarial system where these kind of checks are not just implied, they're required. Justice requires these sort of independent checks. So if you're doing a good job and you have a good case and you have good evidence, you want people to look at it. When people ask me like, Dr. Turvey, can I see the results of this? Can I see this? Can I see that? How'd you come to this finding? How'd you do that? I'm like, so glad you asked. Please. Here's my notebook. Here are my notes. Here's my report. Here's my resume. Let's talk about it for hours. And you get prosecutors or opposing counsel in different cases who think that they're going to trip you up by asking you about your resume or your writing. I'm like, no, man, I want to talk about my books. I want to talk about my history. I want to talk about these cases. I want to talk all about it, because if you want to talk about that, we can talk about me for hours if that's what you want. Because
they have no problem with that.
Well, the reason why is because they think that I'm faking it, like their own experts. Yeah. They think they think that I'm frightened of the review, like their own people are. And real scientists are not. Real scientists are transparent. They submit their stuff for review all the time, their resumes for review, their procedures and methodology for review, and they love to be asked questions. Right. The only people who do not like this conversation are people who are faking things or who are dangerously ignorant. Well, last word to you, Melanie. Any thoughts you want to have about from your outside perspective as you're entering more fully on the things that have caught your attention mostly on this issue? What's caught your attention the most?
What has caught my attention the most on this issue is that what I perceive to be real doesn't even exist. It doesn't exist. All of the things that I thought from, like we were just talking about, the shows and even some of the education I went through early on, it's not there. Looking through our casework, there are things that I would assume that would be done by a professional that aren't even done by a professional. The lack of investigations, the lack of professionalism, all of that.
It is horrifying, because once you go through the looking glass and you're like, and nobody wants to hear it. What's fascinating to me is two things. Is one, the angry denials from the community who are pretending not to be knowledgeable of all the scandals that are just immediately in the environment and on any given moment. And then asking you to pretend too.
Yeah.
Now I'll leave with this thought. Hey, no problem, Roger. I'll leave with this thought. And it's a direct quote from one of my favorite defense attorney clients I worked on a serial murder case with. He's a very smart guy, former prosecutor, good guy. Really, really enjoyed working with him. And he said this thing to me one time. We were walking around this crime scene. We were outside looking at stuff, and there were these turkeys flying into the trees. It was horrible. It was a very weird, surreal moment at night, because we were trying to recreate the moment. And this is at the Lafayette Reservoir in California. We're walking around, and he goes, you know what, Turvey? You know what I like about you? You say it like it is. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, this is my impression of Turvey. I'm not unfriendly. I just have a hard time playing dumb.
Yes.
And that's what it comes down to for me. I'm really not an unfriendly person.
At the beginning, when we first started talking, before I took any of the courses, you said to me, are you sure you want to go down this path? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And life is going to be difficult. And I was just like, no, I do. This is what I want to do. But I had no idea that now that I've seen everything, and like you said, you can't have the conversation with anyone. You just can't. And I can't unsee all of these things.
And most of the people who talk about forensic science or talk about crime, they don't have the first clue what a real case looks like, and the negligence and the violations and the constant limitations of the state in their process. They don't understand it at all. They want to believe that it's way more competent than it actually is.
They do.
Well,
did.
That was the CSI effect in a nutshell. The perpetuation of this myth of exceptionalism among law enforcement and forensic science that gets transmitted to the public in terms of overconfidence, and then that forensic scientists who work for the state are forced to participate in. We call that forced negligence. And if you're working privately, you are able to talk about it if you want, but you will not be rewarded for it.
No.
So, all right. Let's leave it there, Melanie. You are absolutely delightful to talk to. I always appreciate your perspective because it's way different than mine usually, and I like the way you speak it plain. But also, you have a better sense of empathy than I do, I think, and so I appreciate that. It's important to understand that these cases impact people. It affects people's lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for people who are interested, we will be doing this every other week. Every 2 weeks. However, we skipped a week, so we have to do it again next week to keep our schedule. We are nothing if not on our schedule. So we'll be here again next week, and then every 2 weeks after, unless something happens, like it happened last week. You can find us on Spotify. So if you go on Spotify, you can look up the title of this podcast, The Hard Truth, and you will find us without any problem. You can follow us there. You can download it, listen to it in your car, listen to it wherever you want. And hopefully this conversation that we're having will spark a conversation between you and your friends and your family and your colleagues. And if you're working in the justice system, or you're a student, hopefully this has fired your imagination. If you have any questions, email or contact us on Facebook, Melanie or I, and we'll get back to you, and we'll point you to some information. And as always, there's going to be links to some of the things we talked about and other resources for those who are interested. Thank you so much, and everybody have a pleasant week.